Before I start the main part of my little talk, I thought it may be of value to you that I give you a very brief resume of my background so you can understand why and how I am here today talking about aviation. In 2 days' time, I'll be celebrating 50 years of continuous work in aviation, which is very sobering thought, but time does fly by, forgive the pun. I joined the Air Force on the 3rd of September 1964 as an officer cadet, and I took an option to retire 20 years later in 1984. Most of my time in the Air Force was spent as a search and rescue helicopter pilot, which included setting up and running the seeking operation at RAF Coltishall from 1979 to 1982. Having come to Norfolk and East Anglia, I liked it so much I stayed here. I've been here ever since. Having left the RAF, I was determined to continue my flying career like HRH, and so started a commercial helicopter operation at Norwich Airport. I continued this until 2010, some 25 years later, when I retired from full-time employment. I was closely involved with the startup of EAAA, as Patrick has already mentioned, as my company provided the helicopters, the crews, and the accommodation. I flew on many of the early missions until my retirement at the age of 60, which is a legal requirement. You can't fly helicopters for commercial operations if there's only one pilot on board once you reach 60. On my retirement in 2010, I was delighted and honoured to be offered this position of aviation consultant to the EAAA. So here I am today, 4 years on, still in post and enjoying immensely, apart from the almost daily reminders from my wife, or comments from my wife, that she thought I'd retire. When Diane asked me to give a 10-minute talk on aviation, I pondered on what particular aspect of this enormous subject would be of most interest to you all today. I imagine that you will come from a variety of backgrounds, and some of you may not have an in-depth knowledge of the aviation aspects of the air ambulance. With this in mind, I have decided to concentrate on the aspect of aviation which we're all involved on a daily basis, that is, the air ambulance. So my aim today is to discuss these two very important aspects in more detail. Firstly, let's talk about the crew, which consists of pilot, doctor and paramedic. My plan was to introduce a pilot, a doctor and paramedic on the crew today, but the best laid plans have gone by the board. But I'll talk about the pilot as I'm an old pilot. Basically, in our operation, most of the pilots are all employed full-time. We don't have part-time pilots. We don't have volunteer pilots, as some people have suggested. That is just not possible. Majority of pilots in the air ambulance world are ex-military. The reason for this is not because people who have come up through the civilian world are any worse, it's just there are not so many of them. And in fact, I have the greatest respect for the civilian pilots who educated themselves to reach the standard. We have one of them, Chris Sheriff, who is not here today, and he's based at Cambridge. He paid for his own training and built up enough hours to come and join us, and he's done a very fine job alongside the military pilots. In order to be qualified to do our job as a pilot, each pilot has to have at least 1,000 hours of pilot in command. That may seem a lot, and it is quite a lot if you're struggling to build up the hours, as Chris was. But most military pilots come to us for 2,000 or 3,000 hours, as I did. So the job is, in a way, very similar to military flying. It involves low flying, it involves quick reaction to a call, and you're flying to somewhere where you have never been before, and you have to apply set procedures to make this a safe landing. So the job actually is a great challenge, and it's very enjoyable, and I find it as a significant part of my career to look back on. I will now ask Jeremy, who is standing somewhere there, who's one of our doctors who's been flying with us for many years, just to stand in and talk very briefly for a couple of minutes about the doctors who fly with us and the paramedics. So I'll just stand aside for a couple of minutes. Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you, Gerry. Thank you very much indeed, everybody. Well, I'm just delighted to hear what I was supposed to be talking about, actually. The crew, I have to say, are, well, we try to be a very committed bunch. I have to say there are some of us that probably should be committed. But I've been working with the charity now for 12 years, and it's been amazing. I think it's very easy to see on the aviation side, how things have developed in the last 13, 14 years now. We've moved from a tiny little Volco up to a 135, and then the next stage that we're looking forward to is the 145. We'll be able to do amazing things with that. But the medical side has very much developed as well. So in our early days, we flew with 2 paramedics who really didn't have much extra training beyond the average land ambulance crew. And then the odd strange medic used to fly every so often. I would do the odd volunteer shift and just bring something else. So my background is I'm a consultant anaesthetist actually from the West Suffolk Hospital in Bury St Edmunds. I moved there in 2001, started flying with the East Anglian Air Ambulance in 2002. I'd had my pre-hospital training down in London on London Hems back in '98, which is a few years ago now. And you sort of think, well, what else could a doctor bring? What do you want an extra team to do? And it sort of makes me chuckle because in some of the press reports that we get, you see that there was a job where the air ambulance was called and they landed in a field adjacent to the road or village or whatever it was, but wasn't required. And do you know, some of those jobs are the ones that the crew on the aircraft have worked the hardest for. So we've used the aircraft to bring the medical team to the scene, effectively to bring the hospital to the patient's side. And although, as I say, the aircraft side has really developed over the years, we're now getting doctors along with huge amounts of experience and really very, very keen to come and join us and learn about the medical aspects of pre-hospital care, which has now become a specialty in its own right. And we're on the early days of that. Alongside that, the paramedics have been developing what they can do, and of course the kit and equipment that we carry and have are changing. So it's a huge privilege to be part of the crew and learn about all of these different things. And it was interesting, I was chatting to somebody earlier on, that there's a lot to learn, not just about the aviation side, which can be really, frankly, terrifying at times, but also from the medical side. And it can be very, very difficult for people who are used to working in a very sterile, clean hospital environment to suddenly be out working on patients who are in their own home, with their own surroundings, with their own family with them. And none of the support that you would otherwise get in hospital. So it's really medicine at the cutting edge. And I won't steal Alistair's thunder, but it's been a huge privilege to have Alistair on board. And many of the things that we've been working towards over the last few years are suddenly coming to fruition, which has been a fabulous privilege. But I think that's probably about all that Gerry wants me to say, but just from the crew's point of view, we're very aware that this is a team effort, absolutely, as Patrick was saying, and I know that we couldn't possibly lift a skid off the ground or get a cannula out of the pack without the funding and the support that we get from all of you. So on behalf of the crew, may I just say a huge thank you very much indeed to all of you for everything that you do.
Thank you, Jeremy, for stepping in at such short notice, and thank you for all you said. So, having talked about the crew, I'd now like to move on to the helicopter, the other part of the two aspects which make the air ambulance actually work in the air and do its job. So, the way I'd like you to think about the helicopter, it is the means by which the clinicians can be conveyed to a patient in the most expeditious manner, and to locations where there are no other options due to the difficulty of access, such as beaches, marshes and remote countryside, where normal roads do not exist. Furthermore, it must be capable of transferring the patient from the scene to a hospital without causing any additional problems to the condition of the patient in a timely manner. So to achieve this, we have to select a suitable helicopter, bearing in mind the following factors: its size, its performance, and of course its cost. So let's look at the size first. It must have a cabin big enough to accommodate the clinical crew, the medical equipment, a stretcher, and be spacious enough to enable the crew to have good access to the patient on the stretcher so they can work on them if required when en route to the hospital. This is a major issue, and getting the EC-145, I think, will be the optimum aircraft in terms of cabin size. The problem we have had as pilots, from speaking my point of view, If you gave the clinical crew a Chinook, they'd want another one. They'd fill them all up. And they keep sneaking extra kit on the aircraft, so we need to watch that. So it's a very important issue. The other thing, which I'd like to say, there is a converse to wanting a big helicopter to put all the kit in. If the helicopter is too large, you cannot land close to the incident because of the effects of the downdraft and the performance. So it's a matter of a judgment of whether you can get it right in terms of the clinical requirements and the safety of the site. And that's why I say the EC145, which is probably the optimum in that respect. So let's move on now to performance. This is a vital consideration. Speed. Speed of the helicopter is actually to do with time. And that is, of course, of an essence. The advantage we have with a helicopter is we can fly over the roads and across the fields. We haven't got to go around anything. So that obviously cuts down time. The first helicopter we used in EAA could manage about 125 miles an hour, but the EC145 and the 135, which we now have, can manage 155 miles an hour, which is approximately 2.5 miles a minute. So, the next thing we look is range. How far can it fly? Of course, that is very important, particularly at night, where we have one aircraft at Cambridge operating throughout the whole of the east of England, particularly because there are very few refuelling options at night. Now, the other thing which is equally important is the performance. I want you to listen very carefully to this, because it's quite complicated. We are now governed by European law and on aviation matters. And firstly, all HEMS aircraft must have 2 engines, which is simply a safety requirement. That isn't the case in other parts of the world, like America and South Africa and so on, but in UK and Europe, they have to have 2 engines. So the rules and regulations for public transport flying are strict and all-embracing. Our flights are called public transport, and therefore we have to operate HEMS flights to public transport rules, which are very strict. So, to take this further, at all times in flight, in the rare event that an engine may fail, the aircraft must be able to fly to a safe area and land safely on the remaining engine. Additionally, in order to be an effective HEMS helicopter, it must be capable of landing and takeoff in fairly small areas, which require a steep approach and departure. You may have watched the aircraft go off earlier on, and you'll see how steep that was. I'll come to that in a bit more detail now. These situations, like taking off from here and landing here, require a performance classification called helipad performance, because that is regarded as a helipad rather than a big field. For the takeoff, the helicopter is required, as you saw it today, to go up and backwards at about walking pace, up to a height of 120 feet. If one of the engine fails before that, the pilot is able and required to land back where he's just come from. If it happens after 120 feet, he should be able to fly away on the remaining engine and land elsewhere, as I've said. The same on the approach to the pad like this. At 120 feet, if he has an engine failure before that, he can fly away to a safer area on the remaining engine, or below that, there is sufficient power in the remaining engine to be able to do a safe landing without breaking the aircraft or injuring anybody. So that may seem a little bit complicated, but I've decided to put that in for you to demonstrate the detail which has to go on, because the pilot, every day, when he comes on shift in the morning, has to calculate what weight the aircraft's going to be and what performance it's going to have, bearing in mind the temperature of day and the atmospheric pressure, because that affects the engine performance. All this is done in the interest of safety and compliance with the rules. So I'll move on to cost now. The control of cost is met by a tendering process. EA is not a CA-approved helicopter project for public transport operations, as is the case in the majority of HEMS charities. In order to achieve an effective HEMS operation, we need to engage a service of approved operator. In our case, it is Bonds Air Services. And they were successful in a tendering process which we set up in 2011 for a 7-year contract. In the tender, we specify the requirements, the size and performance, as I have just described, and awarded a contract on the basis of the helicopter types capable of meeting our specification at the most economical cost. We agreed with Bonds that the most suitable types, bearing in mind also the location of our two bases and our aim to start night HEMS, would be the new EC145T2, as you've heard, shortly to come into service, and also the EC135T2, which was the aircraft here today and was delivered brand new to us in September 2012. I can't reveal the exact costs of this operation for commercial reasons, but however, a guideline for our current aircraft is approximately £100,000 a month fixed cost per aircraft and £800 per flying hour. That brings me to the end of my talk, and I hope that's been of interest to you. Have we got time for any questions? No, we haven't got time for any questions. I hope that was clear, that you understood some of that. And I would just like to reiterate what Jeremy just said. Without you all here today, including the people who supported, there'd be no helicopter and no crew. Thank you.